All right, sitting here with good old friend Mike Heffron here. Haven't seen you physically in a long time. I have no idea. You've been usually halfway around the world. Right now, you're sitting in Scotland. I'm here in good old New Hartford, which is awesome that we can talk through the internet and have a conversation with people so far away. And anyway, I'm talking to you because you had a really great somehow, and I think it was interesting, especially considering where you came from beforehand. You ended up being a sports reporter a while, and I want to find out how that journey went, what it was like, and let's just go from there. So tell me a little bit about how you ended up as a sports reporter.
Well, it's funny because if you knew me when when we were in high school together back in the early '90s, you probably wouldn't have known that I was into sports much at all. Because I did theater, I was into indie music, and I was definitely sort of part of the. I had no art skill. I did theater, but I had no art skill. But I was part of the artsy community at our school. Um, and yeah, I had played sports. I came from like a family that was sort of sports nuts from when I was a kid. So I played Pop Warner football. I played football right up through JV. So I played JV football for the Spartans in New Hartford. And then I remember the one year I was doing football in the fall and I was doing theater in the spring. And eventually I was always good enough to make the team. Same with basketball and baseball. I was never always good enough to make the team. Never good enough to start though. And ultimately found that my sort of niche and the people that I was sort of drawn to as far as friends and enjoyment of it ended up being sort of the theater thing. But I was still, I was a Syracuse University football ticket holder. Like I went to, I think almost every home game the year they went 11-0. I have some of the greatest memories of my life was watching Michael Owen uh, get the pitch from Don McPherson and to get the 11-0 season back in 86, I think it was. So I've got great memories of that. And then I went through university at Ohio. Again, not really doing much with anything with sports. All my friends were not really into sports or anything like that, but still followed basketball and football and stuff like that. Ended up working as a political organizer for Democratic Socialists of America, and then as a union organizer. Ended up in Kansas City, which I never thought I would end up in. But I got a job in Kansas City as a trade union organizer, head of organizing of a local there of the SEIU. And while I was doing that, when I moved there, I had started to fall in love with soccer. And I'd lived in Chicago and gone to a few of the games there, moved to Kansas City, and just I don't know, there's something about it, but just completely fell in love with soccer around that time, and that was 1998 or so.
A good beginning
And
of the MLS kind of period that we had here.
yeah, it was just when it was great. It was back when all the MLS teams played in football stadiums. So you would go see the Chicago Fire at Chicago at Soldier Field. You'd see, and then when I moved to Kansas City, you'd be one of 8,000 people filling up Arrow in an Arrowhead Stadium, which is about 70,000, seats 70,000. So it was basically this big empty cavern. I remember going to games and they had a little supporter section and they used to mic up the supporter section so they could broadcast it just to get a little bit more atmosphere. Now, of course, they've all got their own stadiums. Kansas City sell out. They get I think a 20,000 plus stadium, which is bigger than the one here in Edinburgh. And for the team that I follow, Hibernian, and they sell it out all the time.
I was going to say they're
So
a pretty
it's
good
just
team too.
what's that?
They're a pretty good team. Pretty. There's even a following here for them, so I think it's fair.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's it's funny because that is where it was. So I moved to Kansas City, and I remember there was an Irish pub, and I went to the Irish pub, and I asked the bartender, who was Irish himself, do they show Premiership football here, English Premiership football here? And he said no, but there's a pizza place on Sunday nights that a bunch of guys get together on Sunday nights at about 6 o'clock, and there's a 2-hour show that was on Fox. Back then there was just like one Fox Sports, and they used to show the highlights of the football, of the soccer, in England. And so I went down there on a Sunday night, and I sat myself down at the bar, and pretty much everyone sort of looked at me, and they were kind of like, they were punk rockers, skinheads, but non-racist skinheads. Makes very clear they are very non-racist skinheads, going back more the 60s English mod culture.
Real skinheads, not those people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, proper skinheads, not racist.
Not the whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. But and then like just basically introduced myself, which was pretty much like, hi, I'm Mike, and I like soccer. And that everyone was just like, great. And of the people that were sitting at that bar, like 3 or 4 of them became very super close friends. Bartender became one of my best friends. And that was my introduction to a whole group that was my friends from Kansas City. So I lived in Kansas City for years, and a lot of them worked or went to this bar that was nearby. And so I ended up going going over with them to that, spending a lot of time in my mid-20s drinking a lot of beer. But also, it was right when the internet was starting to kick in, because the soccer in America wasn't getting any coverage at all in mainstream media. So it was basically on the internet, and there was a few internet startups, and somehow they were getting funding to pay people to go and cover the games for this website. And so I applied for what, I can't even remember how I ended up doing, but I ended up being the person that covered the Kansas City Wizards for this website. And then through that, I went there and covered them for years. Like I basically, I'd sit out in the stands, just watch the game. And then I would just write up a game report at the end and send it in when I got home. And so I got to know some of the media folk, the proper media folk that were there, or the few that were there. And somebody, I think the head of media for them recommended me to the Associated Press. So I ended up actually working for the Associated Press, covering the Kansas City Wizards, which was basically sending 100 words, but split second after the end of the game. So I'd watch 70 minutes of the game, then I'd run up to the press box, type up my report, pray that nobody scored in the last 10 minutes, because I'd have to rewrite the whole thing, and then send it off. And then I'd meet up with my friends back and I'd go down and do the interviews with the players and all that.
And you're still doing the labor organization?
Back then, Kansas City.
You're still doing the labor
organization? So this was interesting. So yeah, so I was working for the trade union. And then I was doing this as sort of like as a side thing, just a bit of extra money, but really it was a way to go to all the games for free. I got to interview some of the players, and there was some really interesting characters back then. Tony Miola was the goalkeeper. Alexi Lawless played for a couple of years. These are some of the sort of the old timers of and the originators of when soccer really started men's soccer started to really take off. There was a guy named Mo Johnston that played there. Now it's funny living over here now. Mo Johnston is a legend in Scotland. And he was playing out his final years in Kansas City. He was in his late 30s by this point. Very short man, but had an incredible ability to jump very high, and was a good goal scorer. But over here, he was famous or infamous, depending on who you asked, for being the first Catholic to ever play for Rangers Football Club. And if you know anything a little bit about world soccer, Rangers and Celtic is one of the great rivalries of world football. And Rangers has always been, and still is, associated with Protestantism and unionism, lots of Union Jacks. And Celtic are Catholic, and they basically, the club was created back when Catholic players weren't allowed to play for certain teams back in the 1800s. But both Glasgow teams that absolutely hate each other. And Mo Johnston played for Celtic, and he was quoted in the media saying, I think it was something to the effect of, I'll never play for Rangers. And the next day he signed for Rangers Football Club, and it was the first Catholic player. So, and you had the scenario, the Celtics fans called him Judas to this day. The Rangers fans didn't know quite what to do with him, because he was a Catholic, but at the same time, he scored a hell of a lot of goals for him. And so yeah, he was so he was playing out his final days in Kansas City too. So there was some really interesting characters, some interesting history of covering the team back then. And I was quite lucky because the team won the MLS the MLS Cup, the championship in 2000, the year I was there. So I was there and covered them all the way through that season, and saw some just had some great memories of last second wins and getting to know the players and stuff like that. So, and I think it was around then, it was about 2000. I was working for a trade union. I was making very good money working for a trade union. And I'm not sure why, in retrospect, but I decided that I wanted to decided I wanted to do this full time. I wanted to be a soccer writer. And the way to do that, of course, is to get a job start in sports journalism. You get a full-time job in sports journalism. So I chucked a job that was making me probably over 30 grand and ended up working for a suburban newspaper in Kansas City as the sports reporter, but also doing other stuff too. This is we're talking about a staff of 3 writers. That it's for a weekly newspaper, and it's all about covering high school sports. And there were 2 high schools that I covered. So I ended up chucking that job and working as a full-time sports reporter, having not really done the maths. And so, yeah, it suddenly became very difficult to make those car payments I had on my Ford Escort back then. But anyway, so yeah, so I ended up doing that. And I ended up working for a few years at the Belton Star Herald, which no longer exists, unfortunately. Like a lot of local media, it folded after not being able to get enough revenue. And it, but yeah, covered high school sports. So, which was football, obviously, was really big. So this is suburban Kansas City. So football was really big. One of the teams was actually quite good. So I ended up getting to do seeing some really good football. I don't remember either of the teams being very good at basketball. But met boys and girls, but it was also covering and hockey. Oh no, it wasn't hockey then. Hockey was later, but it was covering also sort of cross country, tennis, and stuff like that. But I got a lot of writing experience basically because you just wrote. You had to write everything, and you ended up having to write a business feature every week too because they needed you to fill out other stuff. And you did your own layout, you did your own photography. This was back before digital cameras, so you were actually it was actually proper film that you were using and praying that it came out when you took shots because I didn't have any training in photography. So I did that for a couple of years. And the way I basically afforded to have that job as a journalist was I also started working at that bar as a doorman, which is hilarious if you actually could see the size of me because I'm not a big guy. So yeah, so that's how I got started in it. And then I attempted to get into a graduate school for journalism because I'd originally wanted to be a journalist coming out of high school. And I went to Ohio University, one of the best journalism schools in the country, but I didn't get into the journalism program. And I decided to stay there and go anyway, got into political science and did politics and trade unions and stuff. So I applied for a graduate school, again, making the mistake of applying for one of the best graduate schools in the country. Didn't also get into that either. It turned out I hadn't gotten any better at math from my SATs to doing my whatever, I can't even remember the name of the graduate sort of exam that you have to do. But so I ended up getting a job, deciding to move on and got a job up in a suburb of Minneapolis. So I moved up to Minneapolis and worked at a newspaper there for a couple of years. Again, same stuff, high school sports, got to write a column, did some other did my own layout, did my own photography. Interesting thing up there was hockey was of course a big thing. And the team that I covered had the best girls hockey player in the entire state playing for them, who was also the state golf champion as well. Erica McKenzie, who I don't know. I never followed her after I moved to Scotland, but she was definitely on track to play for the Olympic team. Yeah, so got to see one of the best athletes in the entire state play hockey, and you could just tell when if you showed up at like a friend of mine who worked there came to just to see what all the fuss was about, and he didn't even need to ask me which one was Erica, because she was just skating circles around everyone. She was so good. Um, so I ended up working there for a couple of years, and then decided I wanted to get a graduate degree in journalism and try it again, and decided, well, if I'm going to get loans, I'd always wanted to go to Britain. Why not go to graduate school for journalism in Britain? And therefore I can do what I'd always wanted to do, which was go to Britain and live in Britain, which I'd never traveled really outside the country other than like Canada, Mexico, and also get a journalism degree. And so that's what I did. I came over here, and I haven't left. I'm not in journalism anymore. I ended up working after journalism school. After I got my degree here, I ended up working for a couple of the national newspapers in Scotland, but as a sub-editor. So the sub-editor's job is to do all the copy proofing and write the headlines and the captions and all that kind of stuff, which made me an incredibly good writer. And really good at grammar and all that kind of stuff. So which has helped in other ways in the rest of my life and all the stuff that I've done. But yeah, eventually decided to move back into politics and charity work and stuff like that. Because media is difficult enough to get into anyway, and is also sort of even more difficult now.
Yeah, it's been quite a changing thing. It's funny because like so many of us of our generation have done so many different things, but I worked temporarily for the local newspaper, although I was in advertising, and I just look at how that changed. I mean, when I worked for them, I mean, the internet was barely anything. And
Yeah.
then within a few short years, I remember them actually saying here at the OD saying, do you think we should bother getting one of those website things? They actually made a committee of like people from different departments, and they had to go around and they were discussing whether or not it was an option that they should consider getting into. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, it was always back then, it was like good news, bad news. When I first started, good news, bad news, it was all good for the newspaper. The only thing that hurt the newspaper was if the price of paper
Yeah.
was a thing. Other than that, so like if it cost more to get paper, it was a good thing. I mean, the entire economy could collapse, but people were buying papers because the economy was collapsing. So yeah, I can see, it is amazing how
Well, it's the death of print advertising is what's largely to extent killed it off, because you don't need, I mean, the death of classified ads. People, of course, why would years ago even, why would you even advertise? It was also, I remember there were a lot of notices that were required by law that had to be published in the local newspaper. And
Yep.
those were a major source of newspapers, of the newspapers I worked at as well, which is the local government was required by law. The state government was required by law to post certain notices about zoning or whatever.
Yep, the legal
In the
notices.
local
I did that
newspaper.
for a while.
Yeah. And then once the internet came along, they just published it online. They didn't have to pay for it. And that suddenly all the advertising revenue within 3 years or 5 years or whatever completely dried up. Like even when I was working in Kansas City, they were starting to consolidate like mad, the newspapers, and trying to share resources and stuff like that. And you got less and less writers and content and more attempts to try to figure out ways to raise money. And they weren't paying as well by any stretch. So yeah, and the same thing has happened. I mean, it's no different over in Britain. It's no different over in Britain. I mean, the thriving newspapers that you see over here that you might see over in the States, like the Guardian or something like that. I mean, the Guardian's interesting because I think it's a family-owned foundation. It's almost like a charity and stuff like that. So it doesn't operate in the same sort of business ways that a lot of the other newspapers do. But like even like the Daily Mail, I mean, they're mostly known in the States for probably the Mail online stuff, which is largely celebrity. Sort of, I think I just saw it described the other day as like celebrity goes to get coffee kind of stories, which, and then they just try to pick up as much internet revenue as they can. But yeah, I mean, it's the same problem here. Local journalism here, local newspapers have completely been decimated by it. So it's very sad. And you see the effect on small town journalism, because small town journalism is extremely important to know what's going on in your own community. Like New York Times or even the Post Standard in Syracuse or whatever, isn't going to cover what's going on at the county commissioners meeting in Oneida County or something like that, but that has direct effects on what happens to the people there. So it's, and nobody's quite figured out what they're going to do about local news.
They don't usually cover anything until after the fact, if they covered it at all.
Yeah. So how else are you going to find out about it? I mean, you're not.
No, you used to be able to look at a calendar and say, all right, I know something's coming up, or hey, there's a count. They'd have something like countdown to discussion on. I actually remember when they had the Sangertown Mall, they were talking about, there was constantly like, hey, we're announcing a board or announcing a meeting because of the effect on the wetlands, and that's going to come up in 2 weeks. And it was like, and now it's like, I read about things and it's like, oh, I kind of would have liked to have been there, or like, and I know people on some of these boards and stuff, and I still don't find out about it. They are like, hey, we barely know about it and we're on the boards because there's so much communication, yet so much lost communication when it comes to the.
Well, and that lost communication means lack of accountability, right? So if there's not a journalist covering that, then all sorts of things can get passed and happen without anybody paying any attention about it because they don't know about it, right? So things happen in the community. So that's why local journalism is so important. I mean, they've talked about over here about the BBC is such a behemoth that the BBC should be, and we all pay over in Britain, we pay a license fee. We pay £10 a month to access, if you want to access the BBC. And that's why the BBC is largely so successful. Everybody has a buy-in to it. It's a national broadcaster. And it can do the news coverage and it can do the thing because everybody in the country is required to pay 10 quid a month to access the content of it. And they've talked about the BBC expanding so much that they should actually be giving back. There should be figuring out a way to get back into local journalism. They haven't quite figured out how to do that, but because it just ends up eating up everything else. Because the BBC has local coverage, they'll do a little bit of local coverage and stuff like that, but it's not to the extent that otherwise other newspapers would in the past and stuff like that.
So I just quickly looked up just for you because you mentioned her. Erica McKenzie is ranked the 12th best ever female hockey player to come out of Minnesota, and Minnesota is the state of hockey according to them. According to them,
it is.
I know Massachusetts.
Well, from everything I saw and experienced,
but and a couple other places, and there's been some good people coming out of New York, but whatever. She was named her senior year. She was named Miss Hockey Minnesota because she was best. She represented the U.S. national team, winning a gold medal over Canada in the Four Nations Cup in 2008. She was hoped to compete in the Winter Olympics, but then she tore her MCL.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. So, and that is kind of a tough injury. I'm fighting a little bit of that myself, and I'm not on that level. And anyway, she never made it back onto the ice. Good news, though, is she is partially working for the Minnesota Wild, which is Minnesota's NHL.
Of course, yes.
So
Minnesota's long-suffering hockey team, despite being from at least from my experience of living there and briefly getting into hockey. So, but I'm a Rangers fan, so I've been a long-suffering. I mean, basically, I imported all of my dad's favorite sports teams, and he picked all of the losers. He picked except he didn't pick the Jets. But I'm a Knicks fan. I mean, I'm a Mets fan. I mean, come on, Dad. So anyway, yeah.
Hey, good news. If you're following the Rangers at all, they just started the season in last place.
Hey, there you go. Well, the Knicks, I think, have won 3 games and it made the New York Times like sort of front of the page of the sports page. They won because they won 3 games in a row or something like that.
Well, they've only had 1 game so far, and they're the first team to get shut out, and they have the largest goals deficit because they lost 4-0. So.
Well, it's funny because the two of us have a connection actually with probably a brief one, and you probably less than I do. But do you remember Elliot Esch, who
yes.
Sadly passed away in his early 20s? But his he went to a nearby high school. In fact, we got introduced by someone who went to Whitesboro High School, and as Elliot, this is Mike. Mike runs the underground newspaper at New Hartford. Mike, this is Elliot. Elliot runs the underground newspaper at Whitesboro High School. Yeah,
You
yeah.
ran that?
Shh, don't tell anyone.
I didn't think that was
Don't tell
out.
anyone. Yeah. The Anyway, his brother was a very famous goalkeeper for was it the Phoenix Coyotes? Was that the main?
Yeah, he played for a couple different teams, the Flyers. He
Flyers. That was it. The
he's
Flyers.
kind of the president of the Utica Comets right now.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah, he's quite involved in Utica sports. So
Okay.
if you ever come
Yeah,
back here, you'll see that.
Okay. Yeah, so yeah, I clearly have not been paying any attention since, but I remember him playing for the Flyers and thinking it'd be really cool to get a hockey jersey with Esh on the back in honor of my friend, and then realizing well, he plays for the Flyers. I can't. There's no
Well, he
way.
did that for a while. He played for a bunch of teams. I
But
just
as a Rangers fan, there's no chance I'm ever going to wear a Flyers jersey. So that's
no. I don't blame you on that one. And but anyway, I need to walk away from the Rangers conversation because I'm a Rangers fan and they just break my heart because they either get people who are ancient on their team who we don't need, or when they get somebody I love, they get rid of them and keep the people I'm like, eh. So
yeah. Well,
still
my brother, him has gotten into his sons, or his two sons are hockey fanatics, and so yeah, so hockey's something that no one in our family ever played, including my youngest brother. But his sons are hockey mad. I never could learn how to skate backwards, so I could never play hockey. So I still to this day cannot ice skate backwards. So and you cannot play hockey unless you can skate backwards.
yeah, not well. No.
No, well.
No. I'm actually surprised to see how much hockey is increasing over there in the UK, across the
There
board.
is a local hockey team, the Edinburgh Capitals, I believe, are their name, and we've met to go see them at some point or another, but I've never quite made it over there. But yeah,
There is one of the people I follow on the internet who is absolutely fantastic when it talks about new gear and everything like that is actually from England. And I'm like going, wait a second. I follow a guy from England I'm like expecting to follow some guy when they said London. When I actually read the thing, it says broadcasted from London. I'm like, oh, it must be London, Ontario. Nope. London,
yeah.
England. I was like, really? And the guy comes on and has got that, whatever. And I was like, all right, but yeah, no, it's actually growing quite a bit over there in the UK. Actually, it's
Well,
growing.
American sports in general are quite popular here, and I mean the NFL is huge. I'm in
Yep.
two fantasy leagues that I've been running for two fantasy football leagues I've been running for, I think 10, 11, 12 years. I think one of them, and it's all mostly Scottish, but British guys that run it, and they've been having the NFL games over in London a couple times every year. And I always ended up going to the ones where the Jacksonville was playing for some reason, or Tampa Bay back long ago. So I ended up seeing some pretty terrible games. But they keep talking about putting a team in London, an NFL team in London. The logistics of it, I still don't think they can work it out with the logistics of it. But they still talk about putting a London team back over here. And there's a local amateur American football team that plays in Edinburgh, actually, which I briefly did the media for, the Edinburgh Wolves, years ago. And it was one of those things too where you could they had open tryouts, and it was all you just show up, and if you had even the most basic level of athletic ability, you could play American football in your 30s or even your 40s if you were big enough. And I thought really hard about it. And then I thought, no, that's just no, I would really hurt myself. Though I lived in Australia for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. And while I was over in Australia, baseball is something that's really interesting. So over here, I played in a local softball league. And it's the great thing about growing up playing American sports is that I'm not that good, but I could hold my own with a bat and a ball. And when I was younger, but I naturally knew the game, and I naturally knew what I needed to do. And so I played in softball leagues over here, and I was an amazing hitter. I was a cleanup hitter, man. I'd hit home runs all the time. Basically, because I knew, but nobody else did, how to pull the ball into right field, where I knew that they always put the worst players. But when I moved over to Australia, I was looking for a softball league to join. Weather's great, and softball is a thing. Strangely enough, amateur baseball though is a thing So you don't see that in America. Nobody plays baseball unless they're playing. I mean, there's some amateur stuff, but for the most part, you don't play baseball after the age of 18 unless you're playing for your college team or you're trying to go pro. Not the case in Australia. Like, other than the capital, there were 7 divisions of baseball teams in the city of Canberra, and I ended up going to play. So I actually played baseball at the age of 41. And I mean, I hadn't had somebody throw a baseball at me, like, a fastball at me, sitting in the box with a helmet on and everything, since I was 15. And it was just, yeah, it was wild. It was fun, but it was just sort of like, it was just totally the different experience. Like softball, like, it's an underhand pitch. You might drink a beer at first base. Like, this was we had uniforms. You were expected to tuck it in. Like, this was proper baseball. And and it wasn't, you were just playing in a grass field in a park. They had baseball, pitches with dirt and grass and baselines and batting boxes and, all the whole thing. It was wild. And you'd be playing in like, it'd be like 110 degrees because you played in the summer. So you're playing in like 110 degrees and just be like sitting out in the outfield, just absolutely just dying. But yeah, it was wild. It was really cool. I still got if anybody needs an adult baseball helmet, give me a shout, because I have one sitting in my closet that I will never ever put on again. I mean, why would I? Nobody plays baseball except at the age of 40, except if you live in Australia. It's really strange.
Well, it is interesting though how sports has gone all over the planet and everything like that. We have we 2 years ago we had a exchange student from Thailand.
Mm.
They have a hockey rink in a shopping mall in Bangkok.
Mm-hmm.
In Bangkok, I mean a cold day there is like 80 something degrees, and you can
Yeah.
play hockey in a shopping mall in Bangkok. But no, I mean, sports, it's just kind of amazing how it's kind of a weird unifier
Yeah.
across everywhere. You run into fans for teams. It's like I talk about. It's like I know the Hibernians, I know Celtic, I know that stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm from here. You know,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
they know our football teams there. I can talk to, you know, when we had our foreign exchange student and she came here and we said, hey, she's like, oh, I'd love to try hockey. I'm like, you're from Thailand? And she'd be like, yeah. And then we said, oh, I'm a Rangers fan. She's like, ew, I'm a Devils fan. I'm like, oh, great.
Of course.
Like, how do we have a fan from halfway around the planet? And it's just kind of crazy, but it's awesome just the same. The sheer fact that I know about like the All Blacks from New Zealand,
New
amazing
Zealand.
fun,
Yeah. Mhm.
amazing stuff. But it is kind of amazing how sports makes the world kind of come together and smaller. And strangely enough, I think we can almost get together better around sports than we can about a lot of other things these days.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a guy that wears a Chicago Bears like winter hat that at my school drop off here at Edinburgh. So, and the thing was like 10, 15 years ago, I would have been like immediately done a beeline for him. Like, oh my God, you like football too. Now I'm just sort of like, oh, there's a Bears fan. Like, it's just, it's on Sky Sports like we watch, and I don't even watch the games. Like most British people, we watch Red Zone because we're in fantasy leagues and we want to know how our players are doing, and then occasionally check in and watch the Giants lose another game. And then, and that's what you do. But yeah, I mean, the only downside is the time zone stuff. So the first games on a Sunday will be at 6 o'clock in the evening here. It's fantastic. Second games are at 9:30. Again, great. But all the night games are 1:30 in the morning. If you want to watch the Super Bowl, the game kicks off at 2 in the morning, which I did last year because I'm a Chiefs fan, living in Kansas City, and I stayed up all night to watch that. And I'm glad I did. But yeah, you got to pull an all-nighter to watch evening sports, which makes baseball a little bit harder to watch, where American football does better because it's on live during awake hours, where most, with baseball, it's kind of you watching reruns and stuff like that. So But yeah, no, it really is something that's really interesting. And the same thing, of course, falling in love with football in the States, and that, both the American version of it and MLS, but meeting all those people and all those friends that I did was through English Premier League, soccer. I have a West Ham United tattoo that I got not when I was here. I never would have gotten a football tattoo here. That's crazy. But I got one in Kansas City because it was unique and different, and nobody else would have had that tattoo. So there you go.
All right. All right. Well, I think I'm going to end the recorded part of this. I'd like to talk to you a little bit more after that, but this is great. It's kind of different. So
Thanks a lot, Mike. That was a lot of fun. It was good
no problem.
memories.
Nice catching up on this thing. So, all right. Give me a second.